Welcome to Lesson 3 Ending Notes from Teaching Articulations with Tech. I'm Brian Thompson. I'm excited as we learn today how to interpret the ends of notes and how that will help us with our music. If you remember, there's 7 different articulations. We're going to learn how to end each of them. One of them is not really up to interpretation. That's a slur. We know that connects to the next note, while the others can be kind of interpreted different depending on the style. Last time, we talked about the 5 ways to start a note and what syllables we should be using. You can see all 5 of them here and maybe remember those so you can keep doing those. Let's get on to our lesson so that we can learn how to end notes correctly. Let's talk about how to interpret the ends of notes. This can actually be pretty difficult to get the same as other people, but I'm hoping through our discussion, you and your band director can communicate better with one another and understand it better. So let's take a look at it. The first thing we're going to look at is the ends of notes, particularly the release. Do you have a classical release or a tongue stop? For concert band, you're not going to use a tongue stop very often. Maybe in jazz band or pep band, but not classical music. You can use a classical release. If you notice the curved release at the end rather than the sharp edge, you can see that in your music. If you're doing it wrong, you look for that tongue stop. How do you interpret tenutos? First, tenutos are going to have a light accent at the beginning we talked about before, a da accent. We want a hint of space between notes and definitely a classical release. Here's how we interpret it. The first 2 measures show how tenutos are written. The next 2 measures show how tenutos should be interpreted with a little bit of space. If you look closer at the sound wave, you can see that little bit of space and how it's a really light accent, and you have the curve at the end of the notes, little classical release, especially the very last note. You can see that classical release. The next note we're going to interpret is marcato. This one in particular, we want a longer style. There's going to be other interpretations of marcato. We need a hard accent, slight separation, and a classical release. You can see the interpretation there of how it's written and how it should be played. And then the sound wave, those sharp angles and a slight space between every single note. To interpret accents, we're going to want them a little more separated. Just for our purposes right now, these can be interpreted longer or shorter depending on what your director wants. An accent's going to have a hard accent, but they're going to have a little more space between the notes and definitely want a classical release. Let's look at this right here. We can see the accents and how much space. It's twice as much space as the previous note. And you can see more space on the sound wave, but you can also see all those classical releases, the tapered release at the end, not the tongue stop bite down on them. Sometimes you're going to find tenutos that need to be a little shorter. You might actually see tenutos with a staccato, or you might not. Your director might just say, add a staccato to these tenutos so there's a little more separation. They're going to be like tenutos. There's going to be a light accent, and they're going to be separated, but make sure to have a classical release. This is what they look like in music and how we interpret them. Then, of course, the sound wave once again. What I like about this sound wave is you can see the curved accent and the curved release. They're not a hard accent or a hard release for a tongue stop. There's just a little separation between each of the notes. Staccatos can be interpreted in many different ways. You need to decide which one you want for that song. For right now, we want a light accent. 50% of note is space and a classical release. You can see an eighth note space between every note. Then when you look at the sound wave, you see all that space. There's not a really hard accent on those. Sometimes we're going to interpret staccatos to have an accent. You could just add an accent to your staccatos to write it out, knowing you need to give that little punch at the beginning of the note. We're going to still interpret the end of the note with 50% space, but we want a classical release. This is how it would be written in the first two measures, how it's interpreted, and then you can see on the sound wave how much harder the accent is at the beginning of each of those notes. Each end of the note, you see a nice curve to give it a classical release. The last articulation we're going to interpret is staccatissimo. If more composers and publishers use staccatissimo, it would make it a lot easier to know what you're supposed to play. Because staccato can be almost full length to really short. If we knew they were supposed to be really short, they should just put staccatissimo. Staccatissimo should be very light, 75% space, and very short, with a classical release. Let's look at the music. You can see the symbol for staccatissimo, but those third and fourth measures, see how much space. You play a 16th note with 3/16 notes of rest in between each one. On the sound wave, you can see how much space there is and how light you play. Let's compare how we interpret each of those accents right next to each other, showing the sound waves. Because we have tenuto, slight space, no accent. Marcato, slight space, hard accent. Accent, separated and accented. A tenuto and staccato equals separated but no accent. Just a staccato, 50% space, no accent. Accent plus staccato, 50% space and accented. Then last, staccatissimo, 75% space, no accent. We can see there's many different interpretations of each accent. What you need to do is find out what you're supposed to play and then play it that way for that song. Thank you for listening today. I'm excited to see you on lesson 4.